Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Reynolds, and I am honored to be a co-chair for the Space Law Interest Group in the American Society of International Law. Today's a big day. This is episode 1 of an overarching set of events specific to exploring outer space law as reflected through pop culture. Today, we are delighted to have with us Michelle Hanlon. She is with the University of Mississippi School of Law Center for Air and Space Law. Dave Conan, War Studies and Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College, Bronwyn Morgan, the CEO of Zeo Air, and Matt Penguin Talon. He currently works at Blue Halo, but the bulk of Penguin's career was as an aircraft pilot and also managing space and handling the space portfolio for Navy assets and interests. Today is your first episode. Why should you care about Han Solo and Captain Kirk? Isn't ASIL a serious legal organization? Well, it is. And our goal today isn't to trivialize these important legal issues, but only to encourage thought and participation in a unique way. Since our earliest origins, humanity has looked at the stars. One of the oldest recorded encounters between art and astronomy are the famous Paleolithic La Salle cave paintings in France. Those paintings are 15,000 years old, probably older. And they depict wild animals that researchers now believe to be drawings of constellations. That's one of the earliest examples of how humanity has used art to think about outer space. And what we're challenging you to do today is to think about the predictive power of pop culture and how that can help us as legal practitioners, business leaders, and thought leaders as we consider how outer space law should develop. Now, I think the 1950 space race really set the stage for our conversations today, particularly because of the legal regime that arose from it. The Outer Space Treaty was laid as the cornerstone for outer space governance in 1967, along with 4 other treaties: the Rescue Agreement of 68, the Liability Convention of 72, Registration Convention of 75, and the Moon Agreement of 79. Now, those treaties successfully established a foundational legal framework. But since negotiation and coming into force, the outer space legal regime has withstood challenges. But what we don't have is state practice. International law practitioners understand that when we have questions about the law, we look to case law. We look to state practice from a sense of legal obligation to establish customary international law. And in that area, outer space is lacking. But what we do have is a very robust catalog of TV, movies, film. And I would encourage us all to think today about whether we would like to live in a world of empire, perhaps as Star Wars would predict, or one of utopia, like we see in Star Trek. Now, I know Star Wars sounds like a lot of fun, and if I could have a lightsaber, I totally would, but I know that if I lived in a Star Wars world, I would probably get killed by raiders because I know I'd end up being a moisture farmer on some remote moon somewhere instead of General Organa. So for me, I trend towards utopia because I want to live in a world that's shaped so that we can all be the best versions of ourselves. But enough for me. There's these illustrious panelists I know have a lot to say today, and I look forward to hearing from them. Now, please keep in mind, if you are able to join us on Zoom, that you can interact with us through the chat feature that you see through Zoom, but you can't break into the conversation, ask questions. So if you do have something you'd like to say, please use that feature. And I'm first going to turn to Mr. Conan. Dave Conan has some opening remarks for us. And Dave, can I turn it over to you, sir?
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a whirlwind month for me already. I've just finished a couple of conferences in which we discussed a lot of the issues that we're going to be covering today. A couple of weeks ago, I did the Corbett 100 conference here at the Naval War College with my colleagues from King's College London and other institutions, Australian Naval Institute, for example. International law is a hugely important I'll say subfield of history. I know I'm talking to lawyers, so I'm sorry. I'm a historian. And we look at the world in a slightly different way from I think the legal profession does, in the sense that historians tend to be time travelers. So given our science fiction sort of focus, I would ask you to think about history as a art, but also it's a science by the fact that we look at documents, original source documents, in order to do sort of intellectual time travel. So historians don't necessarily care that an event might have happened in the past, but rather what we're trying to understand is why events happened as they did. And usually what you're trying to get to is the human dimension. So when we think about science fiction in maritime history, you cannot escape the foundations that are provided by examining the history of international law. And you can start that conversation anywhere you want to, but I like to start it with the question of empire and economy. That's where Mahan started that discussion when he wrote that famous book, The Influence of History Upon Sea Power. He was looking at that period of rise for the British. And, it can start with the competition of empires in Europe, but there was also competition among empires of Asia as well. And the Americans are kind of up and comers after the 1600s. Notwithstanding Christopher Columbus and all the mythology of exploration, there were some sort of solid foundations laid in the discussion of how the maritime world could be governed, starting, for example, with the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope basically divided the world in half between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And of course, what became known as the Pope's line in the Second World War was also the line that was drawn between MacArthur and Nimitz during the Second World War. That they called it the Pope's line because it's the line that the Pope literally drew in the water to divide the old ancient empires of Portugal and Spain. With the later marriage of Charles II with Catherine of Braganza of Portugal, the British basically married into empire. So the Portuguese and British unification of monarchy became the basis of what became the British Empire. And that's a very complicated history that is sort of peppered with legal discussions. And what I would say about the discussions from a legal standpoint, you would have to look at the writings of Samuel Pepys to sort of think about how the British were starting to recognize the nexus between maritime influence and economy in the 1600s. Coincident with that, you have Oliver Cromwell talking about nationhood. What does it mean to be British? The rise of the new model army, where the entire army dressed in red to cover up the blood, of course, if you get wounded in battle, to keep people, courageous enough to keep fighting. Cromwell and his generals essentially redefined what Britain would become. And of course, with the rise of Britannia, you also have the expansion of maritime influence through economic and naval means. And part and parcel to that, it's good to know where things are. So when you think about the pre-American Revolutionary period, you cannot escape the exploration efforts of Captain James Cook, who, of course, was going around the world and mapping out islands. And he pulled into Hawaii, for example, and was welcomed by the Hawaiians. And then when they got underway, they realized, they didn't have enough fresh water as they were heading westward towards Australia and the Philippines. And so they turned back and they went back to Hawaii. And unfortunately, the Hawaiians said to James Cook, I thought you left, so your lunch. And that's what happened to James Cook. He was actually boiled and did not return from that voyage. So what was Cook doing? He was exploring. He was trying to map out the world. And the reason why that's important is because by understanding the geography of the planet, the British recognized that was providing an advantage that they needed in order to maintain their imperial influence. So jumping ahead, we all know who George Washington was. He said, I don't want to pay my taxes anymore. And so, there was the revolution. And when you look at the American Revolution from a historical standpoint, of course, in the United States, we see it as a great endeavor for, freedom and democracy. Whereas for the British, It's really more of a question of priorities, imperial. So when you think about all of that, the demise of the British Empire is a period of great discussion, the First World War, Second World War. And it's during that period of the 1920s and 1930s that really the United States is ascendant in the discussion of empire. And within that context, I'll put you on board a ship called USS Lexington, which you probably remember from the great battles of the Second World War. On board the Lexington was Captain Ernest J. King. And Ernest King was an innovator, a former submariner, and of course, aviator. He would later go on to lead US naval operations in the Second World War. His communications officer on board Lexington was none other than Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein is better known as a science fiction writer who created the Heinlein juveniles, and his best known work, I think, is for everyone is Starship Troopers. The origin of that book is his experience on board Lexington with Captain Ernest King. And what's interesting about his writing is the fact that he's examining the question of empire against the question of what principles are driving that empire in fictional terms. Wrapped in that discussion of science fiction are the conventions that came after the First World War. For example, the Treaty of Versailles, and then, of course, the London naval treaties. Washington Naval Treaty is wrapped up in those discussions as well. So when we think of science fiction, you know, obviously we understand Star Wars. We do understand the question of Star Trek, you know, and the idea of exploration. But one of the things that I find interesting from a history perspective and from a literary perspective is that you do see the underpinnings for contemporary international debate about what the future might hold in space through the lens of science fiction in the 20th century period. Robert Heinlein being one example who influenced the writings of Gene Roddenberry. And as I told Tracy, the experience on board Lexington was the inspiration for Heinlein's writings, which then Gene Roddenberry read and mimicked in some respects by creating the Captain Christopher Pike character. So just to close this out for the purposes of this discussion, you can think of the works of Gene Roddenberry, the Christopher Pike character, and of course the James T. Kirk character as being based in the experience of serving on an aircraft carrier in the 1920s in the experience of Robert Heinlein. And I'll just close today with the fact that the fictional Captain James T. Kirk carries a naval rank.
Thank you very much for those comments, Dave. I always learn when I hear you talk. Michelle, would you please take the lead next and perhaps share with us an example of pop culture either predicting or mirroring advances in space law technology, and if that opinion could also be related to Star Trek as Utopia or Star Wars as Empire.
Sure, Tracy, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And, you know, I'm just delighted to hear from everybody who's been invited on this panel. I really thought a lot about this and, you know, trying to understand pop culture and how we get to Star Trek or Star Wars. And I was honestly flipping through a lot of my books and my son's books. And I settled on Delta V, which is a recent book. You can't really see it, that was terrible, by Daniel Suarez. And why did I choose this? Because it has a real life space lawyer in it. And in this line is actually in the book, quote, "We could use a good space lawyer on the team," end quote. And I'm like, you know, music to my ears. So this book is about asteroid mining. And it's a very near future book. It takes place in 2032 to 2038 time period. And it talks about a rogue billionaire who builds this spaceship on orbit in secret. Nobody knows about it, and it gets off to this asteroid and starts mining it. Now, a lot of bad things happen on Earth, but I was thinking about it because he glances over Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says you can't claim territory in outer space. We do know that we have 24 nations who have signed the Artemis Accords that say, well, we interpret Article 2 to say that at least you can use the resources in space. And, if you think about what's happening today, Astroforge announced recently that they've identified an asteroid that they're going to go to. This is a private company. But they're not telling the world what asteroid that is, because they're worried that somebody will get the jump on them, which I just think is so fascinating, because who's going to get the jump on them technologically? And how can they not tell the world when the Outer Space Treaty requires transparency and notification? And Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires a nation to authorize and supervise. So this in the Delta V, we have this world where corporate interests end up on this asteroid, and it's corporate interests that are building exploration. Has a space hotel, another corporate interest. So very privately oriented, brave new world out there for space. And so, and he talks about Article 2. He talks about Article 5, the return and rescue portion of the Outer Space Treaty, because our hardy explorers have to, sort of scrabble to get back to Earth. But he also says, more than once in the book, in space, possession is 99.9% of the law. And that's what I was like, okay, he's right. Now, how do we make it so that's not right? Because if possession is 99.9% of the law in the future, then we are much more in a Star Wars future than a Star Trek future. And if we have these I'm not going to call them rogue billionaires, because I think our billionaires on Earth right now who are interested in space are doing a huge service to humanity by spending their own fortunes trying to get to space. But if you do have billionaires instead sort of looking at trying to exploit the resources of space for their own benefit solely, I don't see how we get to this universal sort of, the UN on steroids world of Star Trek, right? There's no path in Delta V towards that kind of unity. And it was fascinating to me to think about what could we do in 2032 to 2038 to change that narrative? Because I think that's where we're headed. I read his book and thought, I could believe it. I'm not technologically savvy, so I'm not sure I buy that you could actually build a spacecraft in cislunar space in secret. But okay, I bought most of the other stuff about how he financed it, about how he got people to get involved in it. Another thing I wanted to raise, and he had this big contest to attract the miners, and part of their training included an entire lack of privacy. There was, the male and female wannabe astronauts were housed together. They had cameras on them 24/7. And I found this really realistic, because I don't think in the near term we have privacy in space at all. I don't see how we can, because everything has to be monitored. You don't want anybody, you need to know when somebody's needs help. You need to monitor people's health constantly. So no privacy in space. And how is that going to make people feel when we think about going up, even in these space hotels? There's going to be an intense lack of privacy. And I don't see, certainly in the United States, where privacy is so valued, although granted we give it all away on our phones these days, but I don't see how we overcome that. So as far as popular culture goes, what I'm seeing is a lot of movies that are the popular ones are like these corporations going out and doing things, and often being evil, and the good guys having to come and save everybody. And in this book, the lawyer, well, I don't want to, no spoilers, but at least there's a lawyer involved. Doesn't always make us proud, but he's a Luxembourgish lawyer, not an American lawyer, so the ABA is not implicated, right? But because we are moving to this, and I think rightfully, because the United States is really focused on building the commercial space sector, because we don't want the taxpayer bearing the burden of all of that space stuff, right? But how do we then sort of shift that back into allowing us to have a path to that universality that we want? When we have the Wolf Amendment, we can't even work with China, NASA can't work with China even if it wanted to. And how do we get past that? We have China building their own space station because they couldn't be involved in ISS. And that also figures in the book. And I do think there is a sense in China of, hey, there's going to be a point in time where we're the only space station. If we're going to decommission station in 2030, I hope that the U.S. has a commercial space station up there, but we're getting pretty close to that, and I haven't seen a lot of concrete growth in that area. So I don't want to. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm looking at sort of books that and stories that are in the near term, and all the near term stuff is about sort of that corporate greed barring some cataclysmic event, which is the basis of Star Trek. I don't see how we get to a Star Trek world. Thank you.
Well, I know which book I'm going to read next. Thank you so much for bringing in Delta 5. Is that what it's called?
Yep. Delta V.
I think that sounds like a really interesting way ahead. And we hope to continue these conversations too, because I think Octavia Butler's Earthseed trilogy also speaks very well to the concept of shifting that burden from state governments to corporations, or corporations grabbing that burden for themselves if they think that the state can't accomplish that building in outer space that needs to happen. So thank you so much for those comments. Such interesting stuff. Bronwyn, can we add you to the conversation, please?
Yes, absolutely. I will have to, give the preface that I'm not an attorney. I am a practitioner in the space of drones, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems. But this is a subject that has interest. I've had an interest since I was a child. I think people are born with this gene of having a love for outer space, and everything associated with it. But I have been asked a practical question of how do we take what you're doing here on Earth and, replicate that on the moon or Mars or, wherever. And that's a very daunting question because we still have a lot to figure out. But, back to this question of Star Wars versus Star Trek, while I would like to believe that, we could achieve the Star Trek mindset. I think we are just going to mirror everything that we are wherever we go. And I think that as civilization evolves beyond its attachment to things and its illusion of power, just the idea of ownership of anything outside of, this little planet it's a little insane if you think about it. Because if we do encounter as we've seen lately in the news and in government, extraterrestrial intelligence, they would probably laugh at our ownership of things that maybe they've been pioneering for millions of years ahead of us. There is one element, however, of Star Trek, and it was a scene with Alfre Woodard, and I believe it was Captain Picard, and she was, new to his environment, and she made the comment like, what are you doing? Why is this important to you? Where's your wealth? And he made the comment that, we don't build wealth in the traditional means of acquiring things. It's about acquiring knowledge. And I thought, wow. And I remember that from a long time ago, and that stayed with me. And so I think as we see the generations that are coming up behind us as boomers and Gen X, and even millennials start to fade, there appears to be a more an effort or a thought or a philosophy around social goodness. And I do think perhaps then in the future, some generations may get past some of the things that we've been fighting so much for around territory and power and money, which as it moves to digital currency will change the definition and ownership anyway. And I think people are still trying to hold on to the vestiges of the past and what it means to be in power. And I think that's going to drastically change. And it'll be very uncomfortable for an older generation. But, I would like to think that, I might be Yoda traveling through realms. But at the same time, I do recognize that, there's so much that we need to fix here on this planet, and it's going to take all of us together. And so whether the idea of a Dyson sphere, being able to collect energy from, our nearest star, so that we can move past fossil fuels and, be able to do all the amazing things that we're talking about with artificial intelligence and robotics at a level that we only see, excuse me, in sci-fi movies based on the need for certain levels of propulsion and other capabilities. It's going to take all of us. This is not a one nation effort. So I think cooperation and future cooperation is going to be critical. I think learning from the past, as Professor Cohen has spoken about and Professor Hanlon, will be so important in terms of how we move forward. So I'm encouraged, but at the same time, the mindset that we currently have. What's the quote by Einstein? You cannot solve a problem with the mindset that created it. It's going to take thinking at a level that, we've never thought at before.
Thank you for those comments, Bronwyn. I think it was at the time Captain Picard. I think he's an admiral now in the most recent iteration of the show. But Captain Picard said that the wealth that the Star Trek universe focuses on is each person working to the fulfillment of their own abilities and talents. And it's amazing sometimes to think about what our world would look like if all people could access their individual talents for the betterment of their surrounding world, whether it's at the family level, the state level, or the international level, because that's something that I think we all struggle with. And it would be nice if we could make all of our mistakes in literature and pop culture instead of in the real world and learn from those. But hey, at least we have good business leaders like yourself to help us move that along. Penguin, you're up next, friend. Would you like to get started on your perspective on Empire or Utopia?
Yeah, absolutely, Tracy. Thank you. So my thoughts on this really, with my background in the military, when I start talking about Star Wars versus Star Trek, I think, the name says it all for Star Wars. They're already talking about warring, which implies weapons and militaristic use of.
It seems that Penguin might be having some technical difficulties. Until he comes back to us, perhaps we can start thinking a little bit about follow-on questions. And also, we have an interesting suggestion here from Bruce Rockwood at Mid-Coast, Maine. He mentions the Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy as an interesting way to think through issues particular to corporate engagement and colonizing and multinational involvement. So I made a note of that to look into it. And look, Penguin is back with us. Last we heard from you, sir, was specific to the Star Wars hints in the name. We're at war. Take it away.
Sorry. I don't know what happened. Everything looks fine on my side, and I saw you the whole time. So anyways, but yeah, Star Wars, as the name implies, involves war, which obviously means weapons and weaponry in outer space. Now, notwithstanding the fact that, you can't fly fighter jets quite like an X-Wing fighter due to physics, but, the idea of this is very different than the idea of what Star Trek was designed around. So Star Trek, I think, was always more of weapons from a defensive posture, vice weapons from an offensive posture. Whereas obviously Star Wars, very offensive. You have the Death Star, you have the X-Wing fighters and everything. Everyone's trying to essentially kill the other guys. So where that leads, now whether is that leading the world to where we have gone, or is that lagging and we just knew that it was going to end up there anyways, even though we didn't have the technology back in when these books were first written, Gene Roddenberry and others. So I find it just really interesting to start looking at that. And there are a lot of examples of the militarization of space today. So we do know that you know, countries are looking at the possible use of weaponry, kinetic weaponry in space. The United States has talked about this since the days of uh, President Ronald Reagan with Star Wars. So it is not exactly a new concept. We have seen multiple nations launch anti-satellite weapons. Some have actually destroyed satellites. Some have been intentionally near misses. But the cascading effect, the way the physics of space applies, and the cascading effects of creating more and more and more damage to satellites, has to be taken into account from a legal perspective as we're looking at how we how we're going to view a conflict in space. And what does that really mean? Does that really mean a conflict itself is in space? Does that mean a conflict through space, i.e., nuclear weapons that are traveling through space but don't actually do anything in space? So what there's so much to talk about there. I think we could peel this onion for many episodes, really digging in to how the different layers look from a lot of different viewpoints.
I appreciate all of the framing that you put forward there, Penguin. If we think about the particular law that would be applicable, we could come up with reasonable people coming to a variety of reasonable conclusions. It reminds me of Michelle's comments that ranged from corporate responsibility to privacy to the interaction among states, and then all of the comments that Bronwyn had about the variety of topics that seems to include corporate ethics, personal ethics, and how that's manifested through not only a regulatory terrestrial regime, but as you've pointed out, Penguin, the rules that are applicable in space. Now, sometimes we see in academic literature and conversations among international law practitioners whether there should be new law specific to outer space, or whether the current laws should be applied in a new dynamic way. To put it another way, do the laws that we have that are applicable internationally, is that legal regime sufficient to support activities in space, or should brand new law be applied? I'm going to kind of unexpectedly take moderator's privilege and throw that question first to Dave. From your experience as a historian, Dave, when there are new places to explore, do those folks interested in empire bring their legal regime with them and impose it upon the places that they find? Or do they commonly develop rule sets that are applicable to that situation in that particular place?
Yep. So when I think about the history of empires, it's always about who's writing the law. And usually whoever carries the military capability to write the law, they get to dictate how things are going to work. Just you can see that the demise of the Chinese Empire happened as a result of military powers encroaching upon, Chinese sovereignty, which then set up the series of events that followed and culminated in the destruction of an ancient monarchy. So when you think about the law, it's all about who's going to write it. Why do we call it admiralty law? Where was the admiralty located? The center of London. The Admiralty Arch is still standing, even though the Royal Navy, reluctantly admits that they're not the naval power that they used to be. I actually just had lunch with Second Sea Lord at a conference in Liverpool, where we talked about the historical efforts of the past, where the powers tried to mitigate the erosion of laws that they had worked so hard to create. The British, for example, had an idea called imperial federation, which of course influenced the discussions of League of Nations, and that period of the 1920s and 30s that I talked about, where Heinlein was starting to formulate his science fictions, all sort of come together with the debate between Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War, where Roosevelt basically said to Winston Churchill that the British Empire is over and we're fighting for something different, a different paradigm for the future. And they agreed at Casablanca Conference that the Allied powers would be working towards the creation of what became known as the United Nations. And Franklin Roosevelt loved to speak in fours. So, the four freedoms, to include freedom of the sea, and governed by the sea powers and the military powers. And in that world, there were four policemen. The four policemen in Roosevelt's world were the United States and Britain as the sea powers working together, and the Soviet Union and China working together to govern the terrestrial environment. Now, of course, that never happened. The atomic bomb truncated the entire vision, and I think the history of the empires and the world wars is so misunderstood by historians that, as practitioners in the Navy, we struggle to understand how it all applies in the contemporary context. I would argue that history is a function of intelligence. So, when we forget our history, we're forgetting our own intelligence. If we rely solely on the assumptions that the law provides, a lot of times we find ourselves muddling into situations that, historically speaking, we could have avoided had we applied the past in a better way. Just to close out very quickly, I like to think of the Age of Sail as a good place to begin the conversation about what the future may hold in history. History's always yet to be written. That's one of the rules of thumb here. If you think about the islands that Captain Cook was looking for in the Age of Sail, or Charles Wilkes did a circumnavigation expedition in the 1830s and 1840s, actually. Matthew Perry going to Japan in the 1850s. Those efforts to map out the geography of the planet Earth, right, and charting out the seas and understanding the winds and the tides in a scientific way, I believe that is where we should be looking in order to try and understand what the future may hold in space. The age of exploration provides some good milestones for us to think about. I think for the purposes of the literary discussion of science fiction, there is a lot in science fiction literature that we can apply to the discussion, but all science fiction literature is nothing more than creative writers drawing from the past and trying to apply what they know of the past to a future. From Jules Verne to Robert Heinlein to Gene Roddenberry, they're all drawing from the past in order to create the fictitious worlds that you find in literature. So with that being said, Captain Kirk does carry a naval rank, and I would argue that it's best for us to start thinking about the planets of the cosmos in the same way that Captain Cook in the Age of Sail might have been thinking about islands.
Very insightful. Thank you for that. We have some questions from our audience today.
Tracy?
One anonymous
sorry.
attendee has asked, a lot of Star Trek's engagement of moral and legal questions, and particular episodes include Measure of a Man from The Next Generation or Duet in DS9, rely on ethical analysis of complex issues. Does international law need to focus more on codes of ethics for behavior in space if we want to trend more towards Star Trek outcomes? Michelle, would you mind taking a hack at that first?
Absolutely. I don't know, Penguin, did you want to say something first? Okay. Absolutely, and this is totally up my alley because we just stood up at For All Moonkind, an institute on space law and ethics, because the law is never going to keep up with technology and all that we're doing, and because people always forget that the law is a function of humanity and human behaviors and not the other way around. You know, a lot of people think the state hands down the law, and it doesn't. We created the states to create peace amongst us, or try to. You know, that Treaty of Westphalia did a pretty good job for a pretty long time. I think it's going to break when we go to space, as we expand into space. And when we think about, you know, the Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says it's the province of all humankind and benefits will be shared, I think the treaty uses the word cooperation 8 or 9 times, and for a 2-page treaty, that's a lot. And so when we think about what does that actually mean, there's no law there. That's very aspirational. We're going to cooperate with each other. We're going to collaborate with each other. We're going to work with each other. But how? And so when we think about, and I loved Dave's comments about history and that age of exploration, but I want to take them back farther. Let's go back to Polynesia. Why do we need to start in the Middle Age? You know, let's start even farther back. Let's go back to, you know, like totally Tanzania, when a human like first stood up on 2 feet and was like, oh, okay, let's move into all these places. We have been exploring our entire lives. Our entire history has been about exploration. And so what I think we need to do is 2 things. First, we need to raise more awareness of space, because when we talk about articulating ethics, we need to articulate the ethics for all of humanity, not just for the 2 or 3% of humans who are involved in space right now. And we can't, in good conscience, the people on this call, the people at the UN COPUOS, the people at this ISDC conference I'm at here in Frisco, Texas, we cannot make decisions for humanity. We need to bring humanity with us into that decision-making process. And so we really need to raise awareness of space. And I've totally forgotten my second point, so I will let somebody else talk.
It's interesting to hear your perspectives on this, because I share that view that the consent of the governed should serve as the underpinning and foundation of the rule sets under which we are expected to live. And we do have choices that we can make on how we want those rules to reflect the values of the society that we're in. And as an active duty legal practitioner, I often am faced with decision makers who say to me, Judge, the law says I must. It's like, well, that's a policy and you're in charge. So how would you like to solve this problem that's in front of you? And providing guidance in that way is I think an important way to make sure that we're solving problems instead of creating more problems. Would any of my other esteemed panelists like to comment? I am doing my best to give everyone equal time to talk, but sometimes it's hard for me to see.
Hey, Tracy, can you hear me?
Go for it.
Hey, awesome. I love the discussion so far. I think it's been fantastic. However, so one question I have, or not a question, one thing that I always think of when it comes to law and outer space is the one scene. I love the movie Right Stuff. Okay, The Right Stuff is probably one of the best movies I've ever seen. Probably one of my favorites. And there's a scene where this guy is running down the halls. I think it's the White House. It's been a while since I've seen it. And saying that the Russians launched Sputnik. Okay, so during that scene, you know, the implication is that we lost the early stages of the space race. However, as I was working on my master's degree in space, I found that enough ancillary evidence to suggest that we might have predicted that the Russians. We knew the Russians were working on it, of course, but we might have intentionally let the Russians launch first, so that we could establish the possibility of the inherent right of overflight. So I think right there we're still talking about that. and there wasn't all these space treaties. Um, there wasn't as much space treaty and background at that time. So I think it's really interesting to see how that has shaped everything since that day, which is very different. I also like to, number one, I would like to second Dave's uh, naval rank. It's really important. Space should be using naval ranks. That's how it's always been portrayed. Anyways, but I find it interesting that this is, you have more Navy panelists on this discussion when truly right now, Air Force and then now Space Force think that they own this conversation primarily. So I think the Navy still has a lot of good input and needs to weigh in because I think maritime law is the basis for what we will see in the future of space, because it is different than other types of terrestrial law. So that was it. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Penguin. Bronwyn, do you have anything you'd like to add?
This is a very interesting conversation in that one of the things that concerns me is how we think about this from an imperialistic perspective, this idea of going out to create, space colonies, if you will, and will we get to that point where this ownership of either a portion of or an entire celestial body, even though we've got some treaties in place now, will that change? As we evolve, as things change, and will that again kind of be a duplicate of what we've experienced here, where people are, separate and there's a caste system, if you will. And then, of course, just the ability to get to these locations, whether it's a space station for holiday travel. I'm thinking of that movie Elysium, I believe, with Matt Damon. Excuse me. Where everybody else is left behind who is not of a certain ilk. And so I think we have to be very, very, very careful how we proceed here. I think, all the obvious comments that we've made thus far, but I think the historical perspective that Professor Cohen has brought up is something that we got to desperately keep in mind, because we tend to repeat these same cycles over and over again. And if we don't democratize, space and, make sure that there is an equal playing field, we're just going to wind up right back in the same place, that we are now. But there's so much responsibility as we now go into another domain, another realm, when we've got a lot of issues. I keep bringing it back to here. So I do like the altruistic abilities and thoughts and philosophies of what Gene Roddenberry was trying to convey. But at the same time, I recognize the duality that exists in Star Wars, and it's a constant battle, and the weight of right versus wrong, and I guess the scales of justice kind of is a nice parallel to that.
Well, I hope you all are enjoying yourselves, because I'm just having the best time. and it's such a privilege to listen to all of you speak on these issues. We do have another question from our audience, and this question is for Michelle. You mentioned that the Artemis Accords assert that using space resources doesn't count as national appropriation under the Outer Space Treaty's Article 2. Do you agree with that interpretation? If so, how exactly is that argument supposed to go, that one can use X without owning or claiming or controlling or otherwise appropriating X?
Thank you. So I'm gonna lawyer up here and not precisely answer the question, but sort of put it in a different perspective. If we're going to explore space, we can't be bringing mud and bricks to space with us, right? It's way too expensive for us to bring that stuff into space with us. So we need to use resources in space. That's just it, period, end stop. 24 nations have said we appreciate and we're going to need to use resources in space. China, Russia, and Venezuela now certainly want to build an international lunar research station. They are certainly going to be using resources they find in space. And so, do I agree with that interpretation of Article 2? I think it has to be interpreted that way. Otherwise, we are confined to this Earth, right? Because then anytime you take something or you use something on any celestial body, you're violating the law. And then when you think about it, a lot of the treaty interpretation, you look at things that happened while the treaty was being negotiated and shortly after it was negotiated and signed and ratified. What happened? The United States went to the moon, and the United States brought rocks back from the moon. And nobody said, oh, that's not the property of the U.S. government asserts property ownership over all of the items that they have brought back from the moon. And not one nation has said, no, you can't do that. That's not your property. Russia and China have both had return missions, and nobody has suggested that they don't own the property that they brought back with them. Japan had a return mission from an asteroid. Nobody suggested they don't own. So the question really isn't so much can you extract resources and use them. The question is going to be, okay, yes, we understand we're going to have to be able to do that in order to explore space. The United States says you can sell those resources, you can do whatever you want with those resources. And some would argue, no, the Outer Space Treaty implicitly suggests that you should only use them in situ for your own purposes to keep yourself alive or for scientific purposes. And a good argument can be made that all of the return missions have been for scientific purposes. And so I think that's going to be sort of the next step, and it's actually something that's being considered by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is meeting next week, with their working group on the legal issues surrounding space resource utilization. And I mean, fundamentally, the first question is what is a space resource, right? I mean, we're talking about energy from the sun, so there's a lot to unpack there. But personally, I think we have to interpret Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty very liberally in order to be able to do the things that we want to do. Thank you.
Great answer. I always encourage lawyering up because it really does depend. When the facts change, sometimes our opinions change. When we switch the bodies of law, sometimes that causes different facts to be relevant. And it's really difficult to answer questions like that on the fly. So that was really well done, Michelle. Thank you for your thoughts. Another question, this one from the audience asks, given there are totalitarian states who are space powers, are there things we should do to try to limit them in their space activities? I mean, I'll speak to that just for a few minutes, a few seconds rather, as everyone collects their thoughts. I think the underlying theme of this particular question is who gets to make those types of decisions. And one theme that's been a thread throughout our conversation today is that of consent and the impact upon the actions by one state on another. When I think about outer space, I think of it as an area outside the jurisdiction of any one state, just as the high seas are outside the jurisdiction of any one particular nation state, an area within which we all must act together, whether we're acting as an individual, as a private corporation, or as a nation state. Now, how do you develop norms, rules, regulations, and laws that can encapsulate that much dynamism as it relates among different hierarchies of individuals? Lawyer answer again, it depends. And which entity is the one that gets to make those decisions? Michelle said something really interesting in some of her previous comments about the focus on ethics and rules for all of us in totality on our planet. On my own personal soapbox here, I have to say that I think it's the golden rule. It's one of the only rules that has manifested throughout a variety of unrelated faith traditions. And in my opinion, it's also an underpinning part of the good faith arguments we find in common law for things like due regard on the high seas, an area outside the jurisdiction of any one nation. So we'll just have to see how all of that progresses. But I am hesitant and cautious when we talk about restricting the rights of an entity to operate in an area that's outside the jurisdiction of any one state. But I'm very curious about what the esteemed panelists would have to say on that point as well. Anybody want to take a hit?
Tracy,
Penguin's up.
Yeah, Tracy, I'm the most dangerous kind of lawyer, the one who is totally untrained and yet has opinions on everything. So, sounds like a great place for me to weigh in. I think part of that discussion also has to involve the fact that, what is an appropriate response? So you talk about the law of the sea, and I think that that's accurate. I think that is probably the best model to use when creating these laws. However, is it okay if I know country X is going to launch a certain capability that I'm concerned could be a weapon into space? Can I attack them terrestrially and blow up the launch pad before they launch? Is that acceptable because I'm preventing the weaponization of space? Or is that, how does the active war on the terrestrial side weave in with the what's happening in space? My opinion is I think it's something that needs to be weighed as the whole discussion is going on.
Any other comments from panelists?
So I would just like to add, when we think about space, for the near future, for the next 100 years or so, we are going to be very confined in our orbit and on the moon, and we just don't have the capability to go beyond that. But there is going to come a time when we are going to be very much like the Polynesians, right? Where you had these small communities, and if one older brother didn't like the way an uncle was dealing with things, or a younger brother wanted to start his own community, they just got into a canoe and rowed, and who knows how many of them actually made it to other islands. I mean, I would love to know if there's any records of the Polynesians who perished instead of making it to another island. But there is going to come a time when we can just sort of, oh, I don't like you, I'm going to go to this other space station, or I'm going to go find another planet. The key is going to be in the next intervening 100, 200, 300 years is making sure that everybody has access to those opportunities. And so when I think about a totalitarian state, and I'm not a China alarmist, but okay, I'm a China alarmist, but we have to hope that the Outer Space Treaty really does hold strong, because if China or if the United States gets to the moon first, or puts that base on the moon first, we don't want them to sort of own a gateway. We want everybody to have fair and equal access, and I think that's what keeps me awake at night.
Very fair points, and I would like to learn more about the Polynesians as well. I wonder if they had any type of prime directive that we could use to kind of model some of our own seafaring and oceanfaring adventures. It is 3 p.m. That hour went by really fast. I don't know enough about ASIL's Zoom link to know if we have any slush time to continue answering questions. We do have a couple of good questions pending. I don't know if we can just keep going or if it's going to cut us off. I'm inclined to keep going until the link just fails, if that's all right with everyone. If everybody has a few more minutes to stay on the line, we have a question here that asks, setting aside various important treaties, maritime law is not really international law, but instead the law of each jurisdiction as it applies to maritime issues. The question always is, who is to enforce the court's orders? In other words, a court's order always requires the possibility of compulsion so that it is carried out. In the space context, it would seem that in the absence of an agreed regime of enforcement, exploration and exploitation of space will be a matter of force, sadly leading to the Star Wars scenario. Comments?
I'll jump in. Absolutely, but all of public international law is about how do you enforce. You know, our entire international law regime is based on name and shame and wagging your finger. So of course there is a concern and a fear. There's no enforcement provisions. We've even the 2 or 3 accidents we've seen in space have only one has invoked the liability convention, and that was Canada invoking it against Russia, asking for $8 million US for the cleanup of the Northwest Territories when all that radioactive material rained down on the Northwest Territories, and Russia and the Soviet Union ended up paying, I think, 2 million Canadian. But what I tell my students is, how many people on this call have run a red light or rolled through a stop sign? Because you just know that there's never been anybody at that light at 4 in the morning when you're trying to get your son to swim practice, right? So I never did it with my son in the car. I was always coming back. But it sets up a framework, though. It sets up an expectation, and it gives us the opportunity to say things or ostracize people who don't pay attention to it. So I don't, as much as I started my my discussion, my remarks, wondering how we get to Star Trek when we're sort of seeing a commercialization of space. I actually do believe we will get peace from space, and that the thing about space is that it hates humans probably more than humans hate each other. It's really hard. So hopefully we will find a way to come together and help each other instead of fight each other.
Sometimes a forcing function is what we need to get along.
Yes, exactly.
Dave, I see your hand up. Would you please comment?
Yeah, my daughter just returned home from school, so if you hear something, that's what that is. One of the things I wanted to say is, and I chatted it out, but I'll just say it again. The history of treaties is fraught by failure. So when you look at the chronology of efforts to govern global affairs through treaty, what you see is failure. It's a chronology of failure. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to keep sort of chipping away at it and continuously try to find the right sort of pathway for common prosperity, all humanity, for example, prospering from the achievements of the collective achievements of humanity. So somebody earlier mentioned governing property, for example. Well, knowledge is property. If you publish a book, you sign a contract and there's a copyright and all of that sort of business. But ultimately, what you want is for everyone to prosper from common knowledge. One of the things that I would like to sort of suggest as we think about formulating rules of the road in outer space, and I use the maritime phrase rules of the road on purpose, is that we know what leads to disaster in the maritime sense when you don't follow port and starboard rules of the road. So I think if we frame our discussions not on legal sort of you cannot do this types of reasoning, and we start to say, well, if you do this, it will lead to disaster, like we do in teaching sailors how to navigate the rocks and shoals in our uncharted waters, it might be useful. The other thing I would say, and this is where I have to say, I'm not speaking on behalf of the United States Navy or Department of Defense as I speak. What I am going to say, though, is I think in the interests of the United States Navy and the Department of Defense, we need to start the conversation now about what the future ought to look like in terms of joint service relationships as applied to combined unity of effort types of operations, not to wage war, but rather to wage peace, right? So it's a different way of looking at it. The effort ought to be wrapped around the collective good as opposed to conquest, if that makes any sense. So yes, it's high time for us to start talking about what the future Starfleet might look like?
Well, we have made our way through the questions from our attendees, and I really enjoyed this time that we had together. And I think that taking these difficult issues that are intersectional in the sense that they span across academia, legal practice, medicine, corporate interests, politics, basically everything that it means to be a human. And in our earliest days, we made cave paintings as we thought about outer space. And perhaps in the next few years, we can look at our books, our movies, and our TV shows as venues through which we can explore these important issues. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for being here today. Penguin, Bronwyn, Michelle, Dave, really interesting stuff. I'm so glad that you're here. And this was recorded. It will be available for perusal. If there's any particular book titles or other names that you wish to get down out there, attendees. And also, I hope that you'll consider joining us in July, where the Space Law Interest Group teams up with the Red Cross for a section specific to perfidy in outer space. So we look forward to that engagement. And as this is just episode 1, there will be many episodes on how we can trend towards either Star Wars, Empire, or hopefully Star Trek, Utopia. And of course, we will all define what Empire and Utopia is among ourselves. So thanks again to panelists. Thanks to the American Society of International Law for allowing us to be here together today. And thank you so much, attendees who are out there in cyberspace listening and asking those great questions. I will be signing off here. Again, Tracy Reynolds, co-chair of the American Society of International Law's Space Law Interest Group, thanking everyone for your participation.